Welcome to the Third Rail Pod. We still don't have a tagline. And you know what? I'm not gonna...
Let's just electrocute ourselves on the third rail.
Or, I'm not even gonna attempt one. That's the thing. Is, I'm just gonna open it up, and our tagline is gonna become, we still don't have a tagline. That'll just be the tagline. And people are like, I wonder if they're just ever gonna have a tagline. And the answer is no, I can't think of one. In fact, I've been thinking about changing the name of the pod.
We still don't have a tagline?
Well, that would... Otherwise, it'd be like, welcome to, we still don't have a tagline. Or, like, we don't still have a name pod. Like, I want something that at least, like, a little bit represents the energy. It's just the problem is, like, I've thought about Third Rail Pod a little bit longer. And it's like a tiny bit too edgy. There's, like, I want people to understand this is controversial, but I don't want people to think that, like, controversy is the point. Because it's not like I'm like, and today we're discussing rape culture, which is, like... I guess that's something we discuss, but, like, it's not, like, the point, like, it's not, like...
The controversy isn't the point. We'll discuss
it's just, like, it's, like, because I'm a maniac, and I'm just, like, what? Discussions about the Joker movie? I'd love to get into that discourse. Like, that's really the third rail I'm aiming for. It's, like, the Joker movie, where, like, every content creator is basically, like, such a coward that they're like, yeah, I'm never putting a Joker movie take out because, like... The 14-year-old edgy meme lords will hunt me down on Twitter and cancel me.
Or hijack my shit.
I swear, like, every single, like...
Pepe memes.
Yeah, I mean, we both, like, follow a lot of, like, sort of, like, like, opinion people, I guess. The right term. I mean, more than you, but...
Yeah, definitely you more than me, because that implies that I have a Twitter. Or that I use it.
Well, yeah, but I just mean, like, in general, right? Like, whether it's, like, Reddit, YouTube... Twitter's just kind of like the apotheosis of it, which is why, like, Twitter's not real life, is one of the, plugins there. So...
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're in the same spheres-ish.
Yeah, so the energy is basically I'm going towards, like, aiming for the Joker movie. It's not like every single thing is going to be, like, hot take. I think rape is... Oh, this is actually the exact... I was like, I think rape is a bad thing. That's the opposite of a hot take.
That's what we... It's like you literally ranted about virtue signaling takes, my dude.
Yeah. Like, that was the whole, like, that was, like, really sort of, like, the denouement of the Epstein rant, where I was like, and by the way, you know what's the lamest take ever? The guy on Twitter who's like, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I think you should go to jail if you were on Epstein's plane. It's like, yeah, bravo. Good job, everyone.
Well, the thing is that also takes all the nuance out of it, because, like, I can safely guess that people, like, say Chris Tucker, probably not a pedophile, probably like, why are you guys so sad?
Yeah.
We thought we were going to be able to touch more children's hearts.
Children's hearts.
And he's like, oh, that's so sad.
I really thought we would be able to penetrate the economic anxieties of the lower class.
Yeah, like, I mean, like... I think it's pretty dangerous to insinuate that anybody who's ever associated with a given person is automatically guilty of being a part of the association, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like the same people who are like... I mean, that's why, like, people like... who was the girl on TikTok I was telling you about? That was the granddaughter of the serial killer.
Ted Bundy fucking...
Right, but, like, her mom, or Ted Bundy's daughter, had to, like, go into hiding because people were like, oh... You must be, like, genetically evil to the core or whatever. Like, who's sitting there on, like, the yellow pages being, like, looking for the name Bundy and be like, this is it, this is my moment.
Well, yeah, and there's also, like, this weird, there's this weird phenomenon where people are all about nurture until it's something that they find abhorrent. And then it just must be innately evil within them.
Nature versus nurture.
Or until it doesn't suit their political goals. Like, it's all about, like, there's no nuance to it. Like,
Right, so, like, the left version equivalent of this is, like, people will be like, well, so if you talk about, like, crimes in, like, high-poverty neighborhoods, it's like, well, no, the system, like, it's, like, the people who live in...
It's a sociological phenomenon as opposed to one that's innate within a given class's DNA.
Right, they're saying, like, well, no, it's the fact that they're poor. They wouldn't be criminals if they were poor. But then if you're like, well, if you become, like, rich, it's harder for to sympathize, right? Then it's not systemic. Then it's like, well, no, they're innately evil, which is how they got rich.
Yeah, which, I mean, completely takes away from the fact that while having shit tons of money gives you new perspective, it also robs you of a lot of perspective, especially if you were born into it or if you're used to it. Like, you know, there's only there's quite a bit of truth to the more satirical line. It's a loaf of bread. How much could it cost? $12? Like, that's... I mean, I get that it's a joke, but it's also really real as far as, like, mentality within the super wealthy.
Right, well, and it's not, like, I'm not saying that, like, you know, getting wealthy doesn't necessarily, you know, I'm not saying it doesn't rob you from perspectives. I'm just saying that, like, if the logic applies that people in the, you know, in the environment of, like, being obscenely poor tend to do behaviors that we would otherwise consider, I should say otherwise, because we still consider it to be abhorrently immoral, but, like, if we use the logic to, like, yes, they're doing this because they're in this systemic, but then, like, you know, what about the people who don't do that? And then the flip side of it is, like, but we don't apply the same logic to rich. It's like, well, if a rich person, you know, does do these things to an extent, it's like, well, actually, they're just doing it because of, like, you know, evil reasons.
Well, I mean, like, okay, so, I mean, there's another thought I just had. So, like, what about treating the nurture factor, your socioeconomic and sociological surroundings, as a magnifier? So, like, if ethically you as a person believe that it's okay to steal so that you can eat, believe that that's morally okay to do so, that criminality that, you know, we consider wrong only comes out when you're poor. Similarly, when it's a bad rich person, they can only do the bad shit they can do because they have the means to do it, or because, you know, a lot of rich people exploit poor people to become rich in the first place. So does that make them bad?
Well, yeah, so there's a whole other, and I'm not saying that, like, oh, yeah, billionaires are awesome. You know, if anyone listened to the student loans episode of this podcast, they'll know that's not how I feel, and I had to censor about, like, the last 10 minutes. It was just like, and then we're going to take all the rich people and bleep, bleep, bleep.
And then cut.
Yeah, and as you all know, and by all I mean, like, all 5 people, this is not a podcast that censors cuss words, so we'll just leave it at that.
Fuck.
But then, like, the right equivalent of this is... God, that's distracting. Well, we're going to cut that out. So, the right equivalent of this is, like, how they treat minorities. It's like, well, no, they're genetically wired to be, like, savages or whatever. It's like, or maybe they grew up as religious fundamentalists and, you know, have all these sort of, you know, culturally baked in things that we don't necessarily consider, like, clean and American in the same way. And, you know, and we've seen this, like, actually, if you look at, like, second generation, like, typically the most social, like, the most economically mobile people on Earth tend to be, like second generation immigrants, because they tend to, like, come from that poor background where they've grown up and they've seen their parents work, because usually, like, the parent, the original immigrant that comes in, typically, you know, unless it's like like a brain drain thing, like, where, like, a lot of, like, doctors are coming from India and China because they're paid so much more here, but typically most immigrants come from, like, a background of, like, relatively speaking, on education, and because of just where we are as a society, they have to work, like, 4 different jobs to, like, keep their family of 5 afloat. Oh, yeah. And so you have these kids that, like, they've learned the work ethic of their parents, who are just, like, working their ass off until they're, like, 80. And then on top of that, they have the opportunities provided to them by, like, you know, public education and, you know, owning a cell phone.
Which is why I would hypothesize the greatest generation, despite all of its moral failings regarding minorities, worked out the way it did because a lot of the people who are part of the quote-unquote greatest generation, that is, the people who served in World War II, etc., they are second-generation immigrants. Like, my grandfather's parents came here in, like, 1900 or 21 or something. So, like...
Yeah, so it's, like, it's sort of... It's kind of... In the ones that aren't the second generation immigrants kind of have that effect, the sociological effect I'm talking about, because a lot of their parents had to basically live that kind of life because of the Great Depression, whereas they, then in the World War II boom economy, were afforded both, the values that come from having parents who have to, work 60 hours a week, and the opportunities that are provided to you when you aren't economically destitute. You kind of get the best of both worlds to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment.
But to kind of sort of list around the thing, right? So left, they're like, well, poor people, it's because of the system. Rich people, it's because they're exploited assholes. With, people on the right, it's like, well, minorities, it's because they're genetically destitute. When it comes to economic inequality, it's like, well, no, actually they're born this way where they're like super talented and the free market rewards them. Which kind of brings me to sort of the first topic, the main one that we were only going to talk about today, which is Ellen Degeneres. To summarize, because this is, to plug it into the ongoing segment, a sort of Twitter is not real life thing did you hear about this before I sent it out to you?
Yeah, it was on Reddit.
Okay.
It was like a news article.
So this was like, sort of like also like a Reddit's not real life thing though, right? So like, this is where like Celeste would be useful because she has a life.
She does?
She does? Well, because we're both bums who like don't work. Because she's salary, right? So, like, she has to work all the time.
Yeah, all the goddamn time.
We're both bums.
I think she heard about this prior to the whole debacle. Like, Ellen's big enough that any meaningful is a very broad stroke, but controversy that comes out around her, especially being probably arguably the most prominent LGBT representative, quote unquote, in popular media.
I don't even think it's arguable. Like, who's even close?
Well, okay, so like I guess the main thing that I'm saying arguable for is I don't think she signed up per se to be a spokesperson.
Well, when I say arguable, right, I'm not saying like necessarily most greatest. I'm not saying she's the Martin Luther.
She's not MLK.
She's not the MLK of.
But she's definitely visible. She's probably the most visible.
Yeah.
In popular media. And so, I think that it's safe to say that just about anything that comes out about her is probably going to hit the mainstream if it's even remotely worth discussing.
But see, I actually think, this is, it's kind of in between the, Twitter is not... So, a true Twitter is not real life thing is, when you don't even know about it, and I'm the only person who knows about it, because... I don't even tweet. I just spend all my time on my newsfeed because I'm a sad person. I am such a fucking phone robot at this point. All the things that millennials are they're sucking. There's all the things that the oldies are they're sucking people's ability to connect with other humans.
You're that living stereotype.
I am the living millennial stereotype when it comes to
God, I can't remember her name now. Sherilyn. God, I can't fucking remember her name.
Sherilyn.
She wrote Alone Together. It's a sociological book regarding how technology, while theoretically trying to bring us closer, has actually blown us further apart, and she annoys me.
Well, I think a lot of that stuff's really, I don't want to make this too much of a tangent, but a lot of the stuff, because it's really interesting, because I think in some ways, one of my long-standing sort of, I don't even want to call it a sociological theory, because that makes it sound like I'm some professor, and not a 25-year-old bum who works $15 an hour or whatever, plus bonuses. But one of my long-standing sort of weird, I guess pothead theories is that more and more, and I think we've always underestimated what this has been to an extent. More and more human relationships are built upon real structural conveniences. The obvious one just being the distance between people, right? The closer you live together, the more opportunities you have to hang out, the more likely to be friends. Anecdotally, I look at how much I hung out with people when I was in college versus how much I still talk to those people. Well, high school too, but I think high school is a little different to a certain extent, because weirdly enough, I actually I don't really talk to anyone that I went to college to anymore. I have probably 2 friends that don't even live in Nebraska anymore that I will text and I'll be oh, hey, like we usually like me and my friend Jenny, like we talked about sports usually, and so like if some big sports event happens to one of her teams, I'll text her about that. But like other than that, it's not like we really hang out anymore. And like she lives in Omaha, well not anymore. She for a long time she lived in Omaha. It was like she wasn't that far away to where, but it was just like it's just a matter of like it's a little bit too far to where like it's there's just not going to be a lot of hangout time.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like I guess that's kind of my point with high school. So, as a, I mean, I don't have the statistics offhand, so if I'm wrong, burn me to the ground. Crucify me on Twitter, and I'll delete my fake, non-existent Twitter.
We're gonna cancel you. Can you cancel a non-famous person?
Sure. I don't see why.
If someone gets canceled and no one's around, if someone gets canceled, it's like the bear shit in the woods thing, but instead it's getting canceled. Like what's like? How do you phrase that?
If
well, no, there's like if a bear shits in the woods, no one's then the tree falling. It's like the non-vulgar version of that. Then the canceling, like I'm not sure how you literally phrase it. It's like
so if somebody gets canceled and no one is around to see it. I don't know.
Well, so what it is if someone gets canceled and they have no followers,
do they have to make an apology?
Yes, that's the episode title. If someone gets canceled,
and no one's around to hear it, do they have to make an apology? Okay, so God, that was such a fucking. We're tangenting on tangents. So the whole point that I was trying to say is that I guarantee you that high school sweethearts who get married and stay together forever are an anomaly. The reason why a lot of high school relationships starts is largely due to proximity, I would argue.
Right. So that's kind of my point, though. So, like, but it's weird because maybe I'm just a weirdo because most of my friends are people that I hung out with in high school.
I mean, same here, but that's because I was a hermit in college.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, hell yeah, I didn't even hang out with you in high school, by and large. I mean, for the first half, and then... I mean, we...
Basically one out of 4 years.
Our tenure predates high school.
That's true. Actually, all my closest friends, their tenure predates high school. But now this is getting way, way, way off track. To bring it back to, like, sort of the sociological things, right? Like, it does add barriers to that connectivity, but I think also it makes, like, it has made social interaction a more... Not that, like, social interaction back in the age before phones is some super... deep experience, although maybe it was. I was never friends with someone in the 40s.
I don't know, you ever seen the stereotypical, like, nuclear family type shit where the dad's, like, buried head in a newspaper while mom cooks dinner and the kids are just sitting there looking at their plates? Like, I don't think people are, like, especially, like, maybe just strictly Americans, like, despite the outward friendliness we have, because like this was something. So I watched a streamer on Starva, and he was talking about how when he was at TwitchCon how friendly Americans were, and I thought that was really interesting. But then it occurred to me that, like, yeah, sure, Americans are friendly and we're maybe generous to an extent, but to me it's largely superficial because we know that on a base level, we're just probably not going to interact with this person again. Like, sure, I'll shoot the shit with somebody for 15 minutes while I'm waiting for a bus, but, like, it's not deep.
Well, yeah, whatever. And, like, no one... That kind of interaction, it's like no one's expecting to, like, me to tell them, like, the first time that I realized, like, 95% of people are, like, terrible at sex and it's just, like, messy, gross, and short. But,
Well, I mean, like, I guess my point is that we may notice a difference, but I guarantee you Finland hasn't.
What do you mean?
Finnish people, or like Nordic people specifically, really, or the stereotypical Finnish person doesn't do stranger social interaction in a meaningful way that's like longer than 2 minutes. If you smile at, well, so the story goes, or the stereotype goes, or the sociological phenomenon goes, Finnish people yell at me if I'm wrong. If you smile at somebody in the street, they probably just assume that you're stupid.
Yeah.
So, like, the idea is that, like, people are already so closed off in their own worlds anyway. Like, there's this... The Book of Sorrows talks about how there's, like, this entire mental phenomenon called sonder, where you realize that everybody else is living a life as vivid as your own, and it's like, well, yeah, we're too encapsulated in our own interpersonal relationships that are point blank to us that I don't think that adding a cell phone to that is really going to change anything. In fact, adding a cell phone to it has probably enhanced it because, I mean, otherwise, my once a month visit to my parents would literally be just that with no external conversation.
What do you mean?
My parents can call me on the phone. And then when I go down once a month, I can talk to them in person. But if the phone wasn't there, it'd still be just me going down once a month to talk to them in person. It'd be even less interaction.
Okay, so you're saying like the phone is just like, well, there's more interactions per blank.
Yeah, it's
like you're measuring it almost in volume.
Yeah, as far as in raw volume. Now, as far as meaningfulness goes, I mean, fuck if I know. I mean, I think that it's safe to say that, if if a child is raised right, whether it be in the 1950s or in 2020, they're not having their newspaper out at the fucking dinner table, if that's even a thing anymore. Like, if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, if you're on your goddamn phone the entire time, unless you're actively trying to disengage from the conversation, it's rude. Like, it's like reading a book while talking to somebody.
But my point is, like, I'm not even talking, like, you're more talking, like, just, like, the volume of social interaction.
Well, I mean, like even with the quality of social interaction, like, it shouldn't, like, technology shouldn't actively affect it, except in the nature of the conversation itself, because we know more.
Well, I'm not even talking necessarily, like, I'm not saying quality, I'm saying, I mean, we tend to associate, like, deep conversations with being, like, a more qualitatively better, but I'm not necessarily passing a moral or judgment value on, like, the depth of a conversation, right? Yeah. If some stranger walks up to me and is like, so, you got laid lately? It's going to be, I mean, I'm a weirdo, so I'd probably be like, no, but...
you probably actually engage.
For people who aren't social weirdos like me, they're going to be like, what the fuck are you doing, right? My point is, like, so there's nothing inherently bad about a conversation that is not necessarily, super deep and personal and emotional. But my point is, I feel like people tend to have these conversations less. One, just because we have fewer thoughts now that are internal, right? Like, we're in the subtweet culture where, like, if you had a bad breakup before, you just kind of sit and stew about it until you get to the lunch table and you're talking to, your coworker or your high school peer about, how Donnie cheated on you or whatever. Versus now, you just subtweet and you're just like, don't you hate cheaters? # not blessed.
It's passive aggressive.
And so there are just, like, fewer things to internally divulge because we just don't have...
We live a more public life. Well, some of us do.
Transparent even. I mean, public too, but, like...
Transparent. Okay, that's...
Even people who aren't on social media, because, again, even among young people, like, active social... One of the things that, like, people don't understand, even, like, among... Like, people say, like, oh, young people, they're all connected to social media, all right? Like, the majority of young people are on social media, but, like, actively using is kind of another matter. Like, the majority of young people on social media aren't really active beyond, like, posting pictures of them hanging out once in a blue moon and, like, sharing a Vine video. Like people aren't really as social... All right, like, social media kind of... To tie this back to the original premise, really, of even just the podcast, like, social media doesn't really represent real life at all, because, like, only a small minority of people are really on social media, and a much smaller minority of that minority is, like, actively engaged in it in the way that we typically think of social media use.
Yeah, where it's like they're responsible for tweeting 400 times in a single day and ranting about an impeachment proceeding, and then trying to intimidate witnesses indirectly.
Yeah, that. I don't know who we could be talking about.
I have no idea.
But I feel like but to the original point, like, because social interaction is easier, because there are a few secrets, for these reasons, I feel like relationships now, because they can be maintained so much easier, tend to be just less depth of conversation because of, the reduction in just, like, deep things to talk about, because people are more open to begin with. And just, like, whereas before, if you wanted to maintain a relationship, right, you had to, like, sort of almost performatively show that you have a deep trust in them if they want to go through the hassle of maintaining a relationship with you. Whereas, like, now you just DM them a meme once in a while.
That's an interesting thought. So,
I've maintained relationships with people, to anecdotally say this, I've maintained relationships with people in foreign countries on opposite coasts almost purely by arguing about football and, like, sending memes to them.
Which, I mean, so I that's fascinating, and I guess the question then becomes, is that a negative thing, or are we just fetishizing point blank?
Right, like, I'm not passing a value judgment on it. I tend to think it's maybe a little bit of a negative thing, just because I feel like the reason that, like, even though we, like, I think there's definitely, like, a generational feeling of loneliness. Like, I feel like a lot of people our age feel lonely, because, like, there is a certain, like in the social hierarchy of needs,
there's a certain benefit to being with people, like, near people in space that are interested in being near you. I think there's a
right, like,
a chemical benefit to that.
Sure, like, I think that's part of it, absolutely. And I think another part of it is, like, I think people still need at least a couple people in their life where they sit down and they're like, today I wanted to die at work because...
Yeah, and the thing is that's becoming even more hard because, like, God, hearing about work is so boring. I don't want to talk about work, man.
We're both pretty anti... How many conversations have we had about work? I think I've...
Well, other than your rant about student loans, which is, like, by and large part of a larger political discourse, you haven't really talked about work. And
I think there was one time...
I told a funny story once.
Yeah.
I remember.
I tend to keep my low... I don't think I've ever had you tell me a story about work, even once. Other than just your wall of, like, media things that you need to catch up on because you lived a repressed childhood, which you were not allowed to watch Pokemon.
Yeah, that's a good time. That's a sad time. To elaborate a little bit on that, the only thing that I share with people about my job is the fact that I have a sheet of paper printed out, tacked to my board, that is a handwritten list of movies and TV shows that I need to watch.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much... I think that's all I talk about work. There's really... I mean, don't get me wrong. I believe in what I do, but it's just not something that I find compelling.
Yeah. And that's most people. I mean, that's just kind of like reality. But to tie this, there is a way to segue in this to what I'm talking about. So the whole Ellen thing, it's basically so to let people know who haven't heard the story, because I don't think it's necessarily a super well-known story. Essentially, Ellen, several times at, like, I don't even know what, social events, I think like a sports game maybe.
She was at a football game, Cowboys versus...
So it was just like one thing.
It was one thing with GW.
It was a former president and war criminal, George W. Bush. And even only 5 episodes in, I think it's been pretty clear, like, now that the podcast jury would convict George W. Bush of war crimes. But this is not...
At the very least, Dick Cheney. I mean, Jesus.
Well, I think Dick Cheney would probably just get executed with no trial.
Now. We have to be the good John Paul Sartre people and actually engage in political discourse and trial, because we have to follow the rules. Otherwise, there are no rules and it's anarchy. But apparently,
anyway, this is not a good discussion about, like, you know, relitigating the George W. Bush presidency. If you're 5 episodes in and you think, like, oh, this is a cool podcast, you don't think it's a cool podcast because you have, like, you know, traditional conservative values. I'm going to say that straight up. This is not the podcast for you if you're someone who believes in, like, the sanctity of religion or whatever. Like, that's not what this podcast is. So it's like, it's not something we're having discussion under the assumption that you believe that George W. Bush is maybe not a war criminal, but, like, at the very least, like, a total disaster as a president. I'm not here to try to convince you otherwise. If you don't believe it, this conversation is probably a waste of time for you. But basically, she was hanging out at a football game with former President George W. Bush, and people on social media got mad enough in real life to the point where it kind of became at least kind of like a C story in, like, mainstream media, where, like, you know, NBC News is like, tweet us and say what you think about, like, Ellen talking about George W. Bush and just hanging out, right? That's the thing. So everyone's mad because Ellen's hanging out with George W. Bush, And George W. Bush, during his presidency, did a lot of things that were pretty fucking bad for LGBTQs.
I would love... Yeah, I'm not even going to just go into that whole pronunciation. That was beautiful. But yeah, I guess the core crux of the issue, like, not war criminal notwithstanding, because, like, I mean, if we were going to hold the standard of war criminal, then we'd have to yell at a bunch of people for hanging out with Barack Obama, probably, if you want to take into consideration his drone strike policy. That being said, I mean, the whole issue is this very public LGBT figure seen socializing and more than likely partaking in the rehabilitation of an image of a president who was very verbally and explicitly anti-gay. And I mean, that's where the controversy comes from. I'm guessing. I mean, there was a lot of war criminal thrown around too, but I feel like that's
really the core of the controversy. People throwing in the war criminal thing because, you know, people 2000s leftist media is still just obsessed with being like, George Bush is a war criminal. Ugh. Like, they just really wanted to get back into that argument. Because I think people from, like, the mid-2000s who are, like, on the George Bush is a war criminal thing, or are, like, really salty that, like, they weren't necessarily vindicated. And they're like, oh, actually, people agree with us now. Let's see if we can, like, re-win this argument that we lost in, like, the mid-2000s.
Yeah, because that's proved it to be really effective.
Because all those failed media personalities are still, like, most of mainstream media, which is
I mean, strictly speaking, I mean, so as far as, like, war criminal evidence goes, I mean, are we operating off the assumption that invading Iraq on false pretenses is a war crime?
Well, now we're getting... I don't even want to talk about that, because, like, war criminal, not a war criminal, whatever. I don't care whether you call him a war criminal or not. He was a failed president who did... Like, I really don't even think. Well,
I'm just interested in how it's defined, because it matters in the context of celebrities interacting with other politicians of note.
Right, and so that you're actually kind of digging into where I'm going, so I'll put a pin in that. But so to bring this back to, like, you know, connecting the two things, the first rant being about sort of, like, you know, shallow socialization, you know, not super deep socialization in this conversation, right? Like, what do you think they were sitting there talking about?
They weren't talking about
right, they weren't
talking about the game.
Like, they weren't having, like, a deep discussion. Like, okay, like, put yourself in her shoes for a moment, okay? Now, this is cheating a little bit, but we are going to transpose some level of personality on you, the audience, okay? You're someone whose brand, from the very beginning, day one, stand-up comedy. This is not like Sarah Silverman becoming woke in the 2010s, whereas before she was some edgy, boundary-pushing comedian. Ellen, from day one, has been a very sort of PC, you know...
Wholesome, kindness to everyone kind
non-offensive comedian. And that's not a judgment against her. That's been her brand, not necessarily someone who's, like, pushing boundaries, and that's fine. Not everyone needs to be Dave Chappelle. Alright, that's been her brand since day one. So she's not out here, she's not really a huge political state. And in the 90s, she came out and was like, yes, everyone, I am a lesbian, and I'm going to have a lesbian wife, and we are going to have lesbian adopted babies. Awesome. And you're this person who, like, is not a confrontational, like, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the statement. Ellen is not a naturally confrontational person. I think we can all, even though, like, none of us have personally met Ellen, probably, I think it's fair, we can give her that level of, like, I don't necessarily love imposing personalities on, like, famous people, because, you know, for all we know, they might be totally different in real life.
Yeah, it's a public persona.
But I do think it's, like, a pretty safe assumption. It's like, at the very least, I think we can say safely, Ellen is not a naturally confrontational person. I think we can all agree on that. I don't want to have an argument. Some guy's like, no, actually, this one time Ellen was, like, bullied at school, and she took out, like, a lead pipe and broke the guy's kneecaps or whatever. Okay, the kneecap incident was that's not a real thing, by the way. The imaginary kneecap thing was an exception, if it exists. Generally speaking, I don't think Ellen is a confrontational person.
Well, I mean,
so she probably Bush's people reached out to Ellen's people, was like, hey, you want to meet this former president of the United States? And you have to remember, okay, the average person, the average non-Twitter user, okay, they still have a certain level of respect for, like, when you hear the title president or former president of the United States, or even congressman, doctor, okay? There are certain positions in society that just have a certain level of respect that, Joe Pod truck driver or, like, Bobby Professor. I don't know why I called the professor Bobby. That's not a very professor name. But, like, that, lab technician Kelly, there's just certain positions in society that have a certain level of respect that, like, the average person doesn't have. Judge Judy or whatever. Like, that's, okay, you might not have to like it, but that's just, like, that's the way it is, okay? Some people are just have a certain aura of respect that society gives them, okay? If you don't like it, just grow up, because that's the way things are. And that's probably the way things... Even if we have a perfect utilitarian society, it's the way always things will be. We'll still always have... Okay, we're not going to have, like, until we reach, like, technological singularity, where we all just become one personality-less Borg that's connected to a computer. Like, that's the way society is going to be. They're going to be people who, just by their social stature, whether it's religious leaders, political leaders, or thought leaders, are going to have sort of just an elevated level of respect in society. And United States president, even for a doofus like Donald Trump, has that level of weight to it. There is no way working a way around it. So if you're Ellen, again, someone who's not a political revolutionary, someone who's not confrontational, it's like, hey, you want to meet this person who has this elevated place in society? Yeah, sure, we'll come over, okay? And when they sit down, at first, okay, Ellen's opening bit is not going to be like, so, about that time we tried to block gay marriage, right? Because that's like a real confrontational thing to do, okay? I want to see one of you fucking losers on Twitter go up to George Bush and be like, hey, motherfucking fascist, racist piece of shit. All right, I'm sure a couple of you would, but guess what? 99 out of 101 of you motherfuckers are fucking cowards, and if George W. Bush, who, by all accounts, is a very charming individual, and considering he's one of the most successful politicians in human history, definitely, I don't think it can be argued. Is a very sociable, charming person if you meet him in person. I'm sure I talked to as much as I hate the motherfucker, I'm sure if I talked to George W. Bush, we would have great conversation about football, because that's, okay, he's great at talking to people. That's why he's a successful politician, and certainly not because he has an IQ of 140. So...
Well, I mean, like, okay, the other thing is there's no point in engaging in this conversation. What the fuck is George W. Bush going to do now?
Yeah, what is he going to do? Be like, oh, sorry guys, I was wrong? Because I feel like that almost has been his public persona post-presidency.
Well, he's basically been on a see guys, I'm an okay guy tour. Like, sneaking candy to Michelle Obama at a funeral, was it? I fucking remember. A wedding? Was it the royal wedding?
Okay, but, like, whatever. Like, I don't even think that's necessarily, like... Are, like, what, we're going to cancel the Obamas because they hang out?
No. I'm just saying, like, he's been on a see, I'm a charming, okay guy tour since he got out of the presidency.
But I don't even think it's necessarily...
I would posit, and I might be wrong, but I don't think that he has any political power left. And so coming at him, calling him a anti-gay, racist piece of shit is about as useful as calling your local redneck who still says the hard R a racist piece of shit. It doesn't make a difference.
Right, exactly. So my point is, like, and people will be like, yeah, well, you should still do it because it's the right thing to do, okay? Morally speaking, yes, that is probably the right thing to do. Every time you run into a redneck piece of shit, the moral thing is to go up to him and say, hey, you're a racist piece of shit, and if you don't stop using that hard R word, I'm going to take a lead pipe and I'm going to break both your kneecaps. That is the morally correct position. But guess what? I don't see any of you guys doing it. And you know why? Because it's incredibly physically and emotionally exhausting to get into a confrontation when 40% to 50% of the country holds reprehensible views. And if you're one of the people, most of the people who are, like, really ripping on Ellen are also the people like, yeah, Obama's also a war criminal piece of shit. Then you're not canceling 40% of the country. You're saying 80% of the country, I'm going to break their kneecaps if they do something like, okay, because I hate to break it to you, but, like, sorry, most people over 30 aren't really into the whole trans right thing, let alone the non-gender conformity. They're just like, oh, I don't understand it, so I'm gonna like, all right, like the average like Wymon, Kelly, and Herb liberal, they're just gonna close their ears and be like, oh, I just want to ignore the problem. Which, yeah, you can get into, you can get real violent with it. Guess what? Like, that's not an emotionally healthy way to live, let alone, all right, like, that may be, like, your moral imperative, but guess what? Like, most people, they're just gonna, like, all right, they don't wake up and be like, what am I gonna get mad about today? So...
I mean, okay, so A, it's emotionally exhausting. B, it's ineffective on two fronts, because I've never... It's fun to punch a Nazi, but punching a Nazi isn't going to change his mind. Okay? Like, that's the way I can say it. Like, punching a Nazi, sure, go for it, kid. But, like, effectively speaking, like, if I have to have a conversation with a dude with a swastika tattooed on his forehead, I'm going to talk about the weather for 30 seconds while I'm looking for my keys to leave. Like, and I mean, like, and as much as, I know some people feel like that's functionally what George Bush is, he doesn't present that way. It's more like, well, let me put it this way. I feel that I would be far more capable of having a discussion with Jordan Peterson than I would with, I can't even remember his goddamn name.
So the whole point with the God, I'm just totally lost now. What was I talking about?
We were talking about George Bush being George Bush and Ellen hanging out with him.
Right. So George, like, it's cute. Right. So my point is, like, 99 out of 100 people are, guess what? Like, if someone offered you $1,000 a year to turn your Facebook into a Nazi shrine, most you motherfuckers would do it for a lot less than what Ellen is basically just like, okay, she's showing up, okay? She's not, like, running, like, op-ed research for him.
Or, for that matter, endorsing his, political points from 2001 to 2008. Like, appearing in public with somebody...
Yeah, and you get into, like...
I don't think it's, like, it can't... Okay, we can't start getting angry at people for reaching across the aisle, because, like, okay... So, we can't get angry at people for reaching across the aisle and discussing with people who are strictly against beliefs that are holistically against ours in meaningful ways, like gay rights and so on, because that is what we have to expect of the political people that we support. I can't possibly get mad because it's not effective at Nancy Pelosi for trying her goddamn best to collaborate with the nitwit who's the minority House leader, I can't even remember his name, to get legislation passed. Let alone, I can't imagine how hard it must be for Chuck Schumer to try to collaborate, because that has been the liberal platform, with Mitch fucking McConnell, only for him to sit on Merrick Garland for, 393 days?
Right, yeah, exactly. And, like, this is where, I mean, it is very relevant, right? Because, like, okay, like, you could say, like, well, then we should just, like, execute people until we get what we want. Like, that's essentially the position.
That's dangerous.
Okay, but, like, it hasn't historically not a great strategy.
Yeah, I don't think did it work out for the French? I don't think it really worked out for the French. I mean, it's a really funny meme, but guillotines really only get you so far.
All right, the thing about the French Revolution is it was basically a 100-year-long cycle of violence in which shit got progressively worse, and progressively they essentially the only thing they succeeded in is replacing the capital is replacing the monarchy with capitalism, which is now the thing that you guys are so mad about that exists in the first place.
Oh boy, it's also something that has completely ruined journalism.
Well, and the whole journalism, that's a very interesting thing, but, like,
I saw today, we're getting off topic now, I saw today that NBC took footage from or not NBC, it was ABC, I think. It doesn't fucking matter. It was one of the big channels. It was one of the big channels that it was network TV. And they took footage from a Kentucky live fire exercise where people were shooting guns and shit, and then used it as footage for Syria.
Yeah.
Which is ignorant at best and disingenuous at worst. And the entire time I was thinking, they did this because they wanted pretty explodey things so people would watch their news and so they could get ad buys. And I mean, this goes back to me watching the Newsroom like last month, where like they had this whole 2-part episode on Casey Anthony where like they felt like they were reporting spectacle rather than substance, because reporting on a trial is effectively useless if you're going to maintain coverage daily for weeks on end, because trials are notoriously slow and nothing can possibly happen. So what do you get? You get talking heads speculating because everybody wants their ounce of blood, and it's the only way to get ratings. And so you need ratings to sell ad buys so you can do journalism. In fact, it's why BuzzFeed has such a negative fucking reputation, because they do all this clickbait bullshit so they can fund their in-depth investigative journalism team. It's frustrating.
Right, in a lot of ways, it's interesting you bring up BuzzFeed, because now we're totally off track, and we'll try to make this brief. But the whole, like, you know, capitalism journalism is a very interesting thing. Like, because given just what society is, I actually think, like, BuzzFeed is like as close to the really kind of the platonic ideal of like what a news organization can be, weirdly enough. Because like for all the thing we say about like if BuzzFeed is killing like, you know, great content or whatever, like, you know, 10 quizzes on which flower represents your Addams family member quiz is ultimately, while really dumb for big dumb people, is like really harmless. Like, I don't think,
I mean, it's holistically harmless, and it funds an effective, from what I understand, and maybe I'm wrong, you know, you can always do the digging and take a look at their investigative journalism pieces, but from what I've read, from what I've seen from them, they're effective and they work. And I guess the core crux of the issue is that people don't, like, serious news, quote unquote serious news organizations don't want to do that. And so what you end up with is a lot of spectacle and bait indirectly, because, I mean, the alternative to a capitalistic journalism system is one that's government funded, and that's even more scary.
Right, like there's no
solution to it, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, because so like that's what I mean. Like the BuzzFeed thing is like it's almost like the best, because like ultimately like investigative journalism, which is like maybe the most. I don't want to say necessarily the most important, right? Because it's still important to know, like, hey, there was, you know, like just like basically the Associated Press sort of like, hey, this is what happened today.
This has happened, but there's
like that's incredibly important just for sort of like, you know, the lifeline of like discourse in society is that we all understand, we're on the same page of what's happening. Okay.
Yeah, but the tricky thing is, okay, so like, you know, of course you'll need your daily stuff, like there was a fire on L Street or whatever, but at the same time you also need to like there's this core problem where if tomorrow, I'll use a Democratic example because I'm nice. If tomorrow Nancy Pelosi said that the earth was flat, the New York Times would be like, controversy surrounding Nancy Pelosi's beliefs in Earth's flatness or something. Like they would not say, Nancy Pelosi, you're wrong, the Earth is not flat. They would report the controversy as if there was a discussion.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with, I don't know how much it is with anti-vax anymore, because I believe that that's more or less gone by the wayside, and news organizations have finally realized that they're not losing ratings for being pro-vax. It's not a controversial take. Seriously. But like global climate change, I guarantee you that if tomorrow, or, you know, every day for the past week. Donald Trump said that climate change is fake and a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese to make United States manufacturing non-competitive. The New York Times would not, investigate that claim. They would just report that he said it. When in fact, I think that there is a core responsibility to investigate claims that are made and litigate them to make sure that they are reasonable enough to put in the public discourse, because otherwise it's dangerous. Because now there are people that believe that.
I think that's a really interesting thing, because there is a fine line somewhere.
Reality has a liberal bias. If news organizations who want to report reality get accused of being biased because they're reporting reality which is at odds with Republican views, aka global warming, then that fucking sucks, dude, but that's how it is.
That's how they be. Yeah. So, I mean, that one, there's not really any disputing there. But I think, the Trump impeachment is, kind of, at what point, it is kind of difficult to find, at what point are you politicizing versus, factual reporting, right? I think the Trump impeachment thing, it has gotten to a point, they've clearly, and I think this is a reaction to just Fox News existing as an entity, where, people are like, oh, Fox is bad, let's do the opposite and just put absolutely no opinion within the context of how we report. And it's gotten to a point where they're basically mistaking opinions and facts. But at the same time, it is difficult, if you're covering the impeachment proceedings, right? Trump obviously committed a crime, but unless you're a legal scholar, right? You can't just say, here are the crimes Trump committed. If you're a news organization, you can say, Trump said this, the FBI said this, yada yada. But it is
okay. So here's the thing that you can do then. So the tricky bit with that. So if you're reporting on the impeachment, for instance, that you brought up, and you want to discuss objective reality as it stands, you can present to the plus and two and hope to God the audience comes to four, because that's you've given them the basic math. You said this is according to our consultants at Columbia University the legal definition of an impeachable offense, including but not limited to treason, bribery, conspiracy against the United States, what's the other one? Misuse of the presidential office to gain leverage on an opposition opponent. You can look at and request the legal expertise, define that to you, and then you can utilize that definition as a framework to, show what he did, because he literally courted China on TV saying, hey, could you investigate this Biden dude for me? That's big time illegal.
Yeah, I suppose, I guess, even when it comes to the global warming thing, right? I do have some sympathy just in the sense that, all right, because it's not actually, if I'm in charge of CNN, right? You can say, you can put a headline and say, global warming is causing blank. You can put that in a headline. But if you say, scientists say global warming is causing blank, and I'm in charge of CNN, that does two things for you. One, it's an appeal to authority, right? Because, CNN does not have a full-time staff of scientists on file, okay? That's not really feasible for an organization to have 8 climate scientists on payroll every time there's a climate-related story.
For any aspiring journalists out there, 80% of your job is having contacts in industries. It's knowing a guy, basically, so you can get a story.
Right, so you call someone up, and then you say, scientists say, well, the problem is that you can't just pretend that Trump didn't say anything, because now he's president of the United States. So then if Trump says that global warming is real, really, and to CNN's credit, and this is not a sentence you're going to hear very much from me on this podcast, to CNN's credit, I feel like they, more than really other TV organizations, have done a sort of thing where they flirted with, or the idea of saying, Trump falsely says blank. They have actually done that quite a bit. Now, CNN's issue is like they still tend to do what you're talking about, where like they are the classic like dig up some Kentucky gun firing range footage and use that in the CNN stuff.
Well, yeah, that and like journalism in America. I mean, I can't speak to the BBC and so on, mostly because I don't follow the Guardian, but I'm getting sucked. Journalism in America, in my opinion, has effectively become a microphone, and that's it. Because they're so damn afraid of being accused of being biased that unless it's literally a talking head show like Fox and Friends, or whatever the liberal equivalent is, Bill Maher maybe, I don't fucking know. But like the whole concept is that we're just going to show you what he said and let you draw your own conclusions. So basically all you're doing is giving a microphone to anybody that can grab the headline, which means guess who grabs the headline the most? The loud idiot.
Yeah. So anyway, journalism's fucked, and there's just not a lot you can really do to fix it. Like ultimately, like if I guess the absolute platonic ideal would be like like a Wikipedia type business, not even like because it's not a business, but like a Wikipedia type financial model where something is sustained completely non-profitably. But really, the problem is like if you're running like Mother Jones does this, like
How is Snopes sustainable?
I believe it's a non-profit.
Oh fucking no, dude. Well, but like like it's like this, like the problem is now we've reached such a saturation of Roger Ailes' wet dream of the GOP propaganda arm, aka Fox News, that we've reached a point where now if we were to reference Snopes or PolitiFact for fact checking, just blatant discussions of reality, they just accuse it of being a liberal conspiracy. Like, unironically. Like, they'll be like, Snopes isn't real, that's a liberal conspiracy. And I'll be like, okay, but here's where Snopes got everything. Here's a video of Donald Trump saying this shit. Here's a recording of him saying, grab them by the pussy, Miss Madam Family Values GOP. God damn it. Like,
well, yeah, and the reality is, to tie this back in to the original thing, the Ellen thing, yes. Right? Like, the problem is that, like, the vast majority of conservatives don't believe what you're saying. You presented to me a great quote when we were at dinner earlier this evening about anti-Semites. And it's basically explaining the absurdity of the logic of their values, right? That anti-Semites know that there is no Jewish conspiracy, right? They say that they're like, like the international Jewry is like taking over the international finance system. Okay, they don't believe that. They just like getting a rise out of people.
Yeah.
All they really want to do is just have power over people by committing acts of violence against them, by taking their money, etc., etc. It's just that in polite society, they can't admit it, and even if they didn't exist in polite society, they can get away with more of it if they don't tell the complete truth and they dog whistle just a little. Even if you're in Nazi Germany, where like you can essentially kill as many Jews as you want to, right? It's still more effective to lie because then the centrists of the world don't have to necessarily confront themselves with that reality. They say one side saying this, one side the other. Another thing is basically unless the entire world becomes like a single fascist state, someone's going to get mad about it, and it's just easier to pretend it's not happening for everyone involved. So, like basically the right viewpoint, like they don't care about the facts. Okay, they will make up whatever facts they need to make. And if those facts are disproven, they will come up with like alternative facts by the beloved Kellyanne Conway was the most prescient thing said by any political figure in the 21st century. Just her saying, all right, she let the cat out of the bag. And it was a meme, rightfully so. So Yo Ho, the YouTube channel, made a great banger song about it. It was called Alternative Facts. Anyway, we'll probably cut that out. My singing's terrible. Hashtag vocal scholarship at done, ladies and gentlemen. But Kellyanne Conway, she sat there is like, well, we have alternative facts. We have our facts, and you have your facts. That was just it. Like, she kind of let the cat out of the bag in just the most blatant ways. Like, pretty much since the dawn of whatever the origin is of modern conservatism, and you can say it's like the philosopher Hume back in the 1700s explaining why like kings are actually a good thing, or you can say it stems from sort of the anti-FDR Republican coalition of the 40s. Okay, from the beginning, whether it was states' rights, whatever, it's always been about ultimately the facts don't matter. It's just so that I don't have to admit what I want, because it's not something you can admit in polite society anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, yeah, that's fair. And once again, we've gotten off topic. So we're linking this back to Ellen. I mean...
Yeah, and so Ellen, honestly, I kind of lost the thread with that one. But...
I guess, what is she supposed to do? And I mean, here's an interesting thing that I learned recently, and I wanted to get your take on it if you knew any more about it. Did she claim that she didn't know he was going to be there?
No, I mean, she showed up and she was like, we're friends, which was a little weird, but I like kind of to the way original conversation we were having about like sort of just like the sort of lack of depth that most people have with most social interactions in the 21st century in their life, right? Like when Ellen says, hey, me and George Bush are friends, right? Ellen isn't talking to her about how she's worried that her kid are listening to rap music videos, and she's really conflicted about sort of the duality of rap of the civil rights and social consciousness and just the blatant violence and homophobia oftentimes and vulgarity of a lot of the mainstream bangers within that same genre, right? That's not the discussion that Ellen is having with George Bush.
No.
Okay? They're talking about the kids, and they're not even talking like, oh, look at that cover 3 buzz there. That was a great 4 verticals audible by Deshaun Watson to beat that cover 3 buzz. No, that's not what they're talking about. Okay, they're just like, man, isn't that Deshaun Watson? That was a crazy play by him. Hey, how are the kids? Oh, my kid learned how to play piano. All right, and
what are you doing now that you're not doing anything? Oh, I paint on my ranch. Like this is something that happened with Jimmy Kimmel. It's like, okay.
I mean, I want to meet the person who is going to be like, George Bush sits down and he's like, I've just been making paintings on my ranch. He's like, yeah, well, motherfucker, have you thought about all the gay people that you killed lately, huh, Georgie? Like, no, none of you cowards. Like, if you're Boots Riley, who, I have my disagreements with Boots Riley, but he's walked the walk, he's talked the talk, he's turned down offers from, like, mid-major studios to, like, make real, like, high-budget, or I should say medium-budget movies for them. But the rest of you motherfuckers have never had to turn down a single fucking dollar from anyone who's offering, let alone the discomfort of talking shit to George Bush in his face. Well, this esteemed individual knowing you're going to catch heat from everyone if you do it.
Well, I mean, not necessarily everyone, because I'm sure that there's going to be your crowd of kitty cat contrapoints who are like, yeah, revolution, chop off the heads of the rich, and it's like, yeah, okay, but like...
Yeah, see, I would argue most of those motherfuckers, like, they just do it because it's performative, okay? But if you speak with any of these motherfuckers in real life, and they're just, and, they become, and I'm not saying that, like, I'm some badass revolutionary, okay? I'm, in a lot of ways, I like to think I do better than most people, just simply based on the fact that I've cut out most of the conservative relatives in my life. But, I still show up to Christmas, and, I don't talk shit to their face because it would make the rest of my family uncomfortable. Okay, I sit in the corner, I drink, and I watch football, and I ignore them and don't talk to them. Now that may be morally like more. Maybe that's what Ellen should have done or whatever. But like that's still.
I don't think you can really ignore the president of the United States. And I mean, so like, even if this were like in a party context, so Georgie's throwing a birthday bash at his ranch and Ellen gets invited and she's like, yeah, okay, I'll show up or whatever, or something. This is purely hypothetical and I'm not sure how it would happen, but like, I'm sure Ellen would catch heat for just being there. So it's not going to matter if you're sitting in a corner watching football. It's the mere fact that you're in the presence of people who the public, yay populism, believes is morally abhorrent. And it's not realistic.
Yeah, I mean, guess what? Most of you motherfuckers are helping bad people make money, okay? Like...
Amazon Prime subscriptions, like you're buying cell phones from companies that have them manufactured by children in China, or shoes or clothes or whatever. Like, if we're gonna honestly criticize somebody for being in the same space and having what would almost assuredly be a banal conversation with somebody who they consider to be a war criminal and or possibly evil, then you got to seriously take a look in the mirror and be like, can I honestly criticize somebody for having a banal conversation with somebody when I'm doing all of this? I mean, I still eat shit tons of meat. I drive a minivan that goes through gas like a motherfucker. I own a cell phone. I own lots of technology that is the materials of which are gained through exploitative measures of capitalist corporations in poor countries. I can't believe I'm fucking quoting the Bible. We have the plank in our eye, man. Ellen's got a speck of dust in hers, and I mean, she's got her own problems. Like, she's super wealthy, and she's clearly doing well for herself. And maybe she could do more with that money. I don't know if she's a philanthropist or not, or how much of it she donates, etc., etc., etc. But like, if we're going to judge the individual actions of one person, then we better be prepared to take a hard look at our own.
Yeah, and guess what? I can tell you exactly. That was a great soliloquy. 10 out of 10. Gold star for Joel. Woo. But, and I know exactly what some of these motherfuckers were, and I say these motherfuckers like, there's a lot of people listen to the podcast, and there's at best 5 people. So this is me getting reps when I get famous, someone could dig this up and be like, use it against me in the court of public opinion. This is going to be a disaster in the long run.
These motherfuckers.
That said, these motherfuckers, these straw men that I've constructed, I mean, they're not really even straw men, right? Because, like, this is actually happening. This is why we're having this conversation. Is because...
it's... Liberalism in the United States especially has this problem where it's these Che t-shirt wearing well, that's actually more of a straw man itself. But, like, it's these people who are willing to, bite the head off of somebody public for doing one thing wrong.
Right, and we'll get to that in a moment. But, like, so, right, these motherfuckers, if you tell them, like, hey, your Nike shoes were made by slave children, they're like, there's no such thing as moral consumerism under
ethical consumption under capitalism.
Sorry, like, that's just factually wrong. Okay, like, yes, if it is extremely, like, there's a high degree of difficulty of you practically have to build your life around, like,
you have to readjust your entire lifestyle to fit that paradigm.
Right, I get that, but at the same time, like, you can make decisions, like. All right, it's not that hard to, like, spend 5 minutes of research and pick the shoe company that is the least exploitative. Okay, like, you can make the choice to put a little bit more money into your wardrobe and only buy Tommy Hilfiger stuff because it's made in America. And I know they're going to say, well, I'm poor. Why should I have to spend... Well, guess what, motherfucker? Guess what, motherfucker? That's exactly what you're asking everyone else to do. Like, just because you can't make as much of a difference as Ellen or whoever doesn't... Like, guess what? People don't just... Like, as much as people like to pretend you magically become a completely different person when you make money or whatever, like, yeah, you're not going to be the same person. That's true. But guess what? Like, it's not like you've made all these selfish decisions your whole life. And guess what? That doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person. I'm not saying that, like, every single person who bought a Nike shoe is, awful or whatever, okay? But, right, it's... When you become rich, guess what? That mentality doesn't change. It's like, well, these shoes are going to happen. If you're $300 million, buying a yacht that was built by slave children is not all that much different than buying a Nike shoe, right?
Or buying a cell phone.
You could have gotten the American-made knockoff and donated the extra $40 to charity, but you didn't. And guess what? That's exactly what happens when people get rich. They buy the yacht instead of buying a small rowboat and donating $280 million to charity, all right? It's the same thing. Like, we can all do better, okay? But we have these double standards. Like, I just don't understand how people have the audacity. It's like, okay, so we make all these selfish shit. We do all these selfish things. We buy Nike shoes. We buy, we eat meat, yada, yada, yada. And I know some people are like, well, I don't eat meat. I don't eat. Okay, let's see the receipts first. But... the vast 999,000 of you are doing plenty of things that you could be better at, that you could live a more sort of sustainable, morally righteous. You could, there's always ways to improve. Is my point, right?
Like, you know what I found out?
And you're gonna attack someone for just showing up and talking to someone about football.
Yeah, it's also minimizing anything else that Ellen has done. Like, it's like, oh God.
Well, and that
I'm running out of I'm actually running out of analogies here, but like, if Ellen's brand is as on brand as it is. She's a philanthropist, no doubt. Which means she's trying to make a difference. And, I mean, maybe there's this, maybe part of her trying to make a difference and, maybe make her utopian ideal of reality is to try and be the black guy who befriended a KKK member to change them, like, I mean, and I'm not necessarily insinuating that that's the conversation that happened, but we can't expect people to be willing to change if we're not going to engage them at all.
Because they don't. These people, I'm done. Because they don't want change. They want to be catered to. They want to be performed to. And all that matters, like, the actual practical effects of an action have real... It's all about the aesthetics of the decisions that are being made. Which brings me to Hong Kong. And this kind of ties into this whole thing we're talking about. This whole sort of, yes, guess what? Most people, they have a lot of selfish in them. Doesn't mean that they're okay. Like, one of my stances from day one on the podcast has been... We need to sort of, part of the problem that we've run into this situation to begin with, where all these people are just sort of, they get away, so that we have kind of taught people that, being morally subjective is okay. Okay? Like,
moral relativism is bullshit.
Yeah, like, moral relativism is bullshit, because guess what? As soon as you introduce moral relativism, because morals are made up to begin with, right? Like,
now we can rationalize.
You can rationalize almost any action.
Heinous shit. Like, with moral relativism, we can rationalize away war crimes committed before the concept of war crimes was even thought of or conceived of. Like, moral relativism is like, oh, well, they were a product of their times. It's like, sure, but these people were also robbing the bodily autonomy of helpless people on their way to conquest the nation that they were invading.
Well, and not just moral relativism, but I would say even just like moral subjectivity, right? Because like I think there are things that are just like morally objectively true, given if you're willing to accept the general premise that like society should aim to better as many lives as possible.
Utilitarian. Well, so are we going for what, utilitarianism? Then?
Yeah, like I would argue, like I'm not sure I would necessarily take utilitarianism as like a literal absolute, but I would certainly say that utilitarianism is sort of, as an ideology, is what we should look at as a general framework of what is morally objectively right and wrong.
We could add another fancy academic word to it. We could make it intersectional utilitarianism. Because intersectionality, for those of you who may or may not know what that is, the idea is that it's like trickle up civil rights. What is beneficial for a black woman or a lesbian, I guess we got to tack on as many tags as possible. What is beneficial for
a disabled, non-binary racial minority?
Sure.
Can we throw another one in there?
Sure, let's go for
Muslim?
So, religious minority. So, the thing that is beneficial for them, in the grand scope of things, which would be, which would intersect with all these things. So, you need religious freedom. You need the ability to not be discriminated against based on your ability if you're able to perform the job in an effective manner. You need to be treated equally as a member of a different race. You need to be treated equally as a member of a different gender. You need to be treated gender identity, and so on and so on and so on. So if all those things benefit this particular minority, then in theory, they benefit everybody else by extension. Because equality in race benefits everyone, theoretically. Because first we have to get there, but if we ever reach a place in society where affirmative action is no longer required because the black community is no longer recovering from 550 years of systemic oppression, then egalitarianism is good.
Yeah.
Egalitarianism in gender is good. Egalitarianism in ability is good. Like, intersectionality says that if it benefits the minority, odds are it's benefiting the majority.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So that's moral objective. That is
intersectional utilitarianism.
We solved society.
Well, yeah. The only problem is getting there.
Yeah. So Hong Kong, like they're kind of two real big sort of corporate Hong Kong mix-ups. We'll handle them one at a time. The first, which we're both pretty familiar with, is Blizzard Entertainment.
Oh boy. So for those of you out there who pay attention to esports beyond, I don't fucking know. It doesn't matter. I don't know who watches Hearthstone, but the thing is Blizzard has a competitive, like, prize money involved esports league for their video game.
Blizzard is maybe the biggest gaming company in the world. Okay, they've made like 5 games that your grandma's heard of: World of Warcraft, Overwatch, Hearthstone. I mean, those are the big 3. And then you have like Diablo, some other stuff like that. But like those 3 they're like games that grandma's heard of.
Yeah, and I mean, now that it's Activision Blizzard, that's like an 800-pound gorilla with a jetpack on it. Like, it's nuts.
Yeah,
it's a huge conglomerate. And so correlated with that, I mean, Riot Games is also owned entirely by Tencent, which is 100% Chinese owned, which means League of Legends is Chinese propaganda. Actually, I don't know if that's true. But like, League of Legends is entirely theoretically Chinese owned because it's owned by Tencent. That being said, so Hearthstone has a competitive league, and I don't know if a lot of you guys out there are aware of this, but quite often in competitive leagues and esports, you get a disproportionate representation of Asian people, specifically Chinese and Koreans. And so, naturally, with the Hong Kong situation, there's going to be a little bit of discussion surrounding that. And one of the professional players who is paid to play this video game on a international stage,
we should clarify, with real money.
With real money, said, yeah, fuck China, Hong Kong deserves to have a democracy. And Blizzard kicked them the fuck out. They Colin Kaepernick, well, they didn't even Colin Kaepernick his ass. Like, Colin Kaepernick was just kind of shoved under the rug and we forgot about him.
Yeah, like, so the Colin Kaepernick, like, they were smart enough to, like, just pretend.
They drop kicked his ass out of the league. No pay, no winnings, nothing. His contract was dead. PR nightmare. Like, that's the kindest way I can describe this.
This is the equivalent of, like, instead of, like,
Blizzard,
32 owners secretly having a meeting, like, yeah, okay, we're on the same page. Like, we're not signing Colin Kaepernick, right? It'd be like if Roger Goodell showed up in, like, you know, basically, like, in, like, WWE wrestling heel fashion, you know, Ric Flair style, and goes, Colin Kaepernick ain't allowed in this league anymore. Woo!
Yeah, and then pile drived his ass off the stage.
Yeah.
Like, this is what Blizzard...
an American company.
An American-owned company with no majority stake, owned by Chinese, and by Chinese I mean like Chinese, not Hong Kong. Chinese companies. So basically, what Blizzard said is, we like Chinese money too much to risk upsetting them.
Yeah, and again, this is a company that, like, no significant ownership stakes by China proper.
Like, this was such a bad fucking move that Blizzard employees walked out over it.
Yeah. And
people hijacked a character in Overwatch who's Chinese to make her a symbol of revolution in hopes of getting Overwatch banned from the country. Like, this is the level of fuck up.
I guess my point is, like, and I want to compare that. So there are three sort of things that I had on the docket today. One is the Ellen thing. One is the Overwatch thing, and then you have one kind of dead in the middle. And this is the NBA. Hey, Future Mason here. Real quick, so the whole LeBron coming out and kind of saying some comments about the whole Hong Kong-China situation that are, to be frank, awful. Those happened after we had this conversation. So nothing that we talk about will mention LeBron James's comments about the whole Daryl Morey Hong Kong situation. Future Mason will go ahead and tack on some comments about LeBron James specifically at the end here after the episode that was recorded Monday. To let you know what time I'm recording this, it's Wednesday at about 1:40 p.m. So hopefully nothing else changes on top of that by the time I get the episode up. Which is kind of actually probably the biggest news story out of the three. Like, the NBA has been getting, like, you know, front page coverage, but basically what happened is the NBA
is exceptionally popular in China.
Basically, what been Rockets GM Daryl Morey, and what a GM general manager is basically, you know, they're your head honcho. You're not the owner, so you don't own the team, but, like, you're the guy that the owner puts in charge of everything, okay? You're hiring all the coaches, hiring all the players, making all the trades, making all the drafts.
You do the heavy lifting for the team and make big decisions.
So Daryl Morey tweeted, you know, I stand for Hong Kong. Fairly innocuous. And the Chinese government, who owns Tencent, who has a TV contract with the NBA,
lost their goddamn minds.
And was like, if you don't fire this guy, we're banning the NBA. And it was interesting because there was, like, sort of the initial reaction from the NBA was kind of, you know, kind of similar to Overwatch, where it was like they definitely did a lot to appease them, especially at the beginning. Like, James Harden, their best player, was, like, kind of put out, like, an apology video saying, like, hey, we're sorry we offended the people of China.
Yeah, he was like, we love China, we visit twice a year or something.
Like, the owner of the Rockets, Tillman Fertitta, like, subtweeted Morey, like, less than 20 minutes saying, like, Daryl Morey does not represent the views of the Houston Rockets organization.
They pulled merch from Chinese stores.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, though, like, what happened with that they didn't do an overall, like, people got really mad. Like, it was one of those things, like, and this is partly the NBA's fault, but, like, it's not very often, like, a joint, like, condemnation was put out with, like, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, Ted Cruz. Like,
holy fuck. These people were talking about the same thing on the same side, and I was like...
Like, it was, like,
it was
basically
weird.
anyone, like, every single, Nancy Pelosi, like, you can find anyone in the political spectrum was on board with this, because the NBA kind of really... This is one of the interesting sort of side plots. This is kind of a side thing, so I won't get into it too much. But one of the problems, and this kind of ties into, like, the Ellen thing, too, but it seems like woke people just are held to so much of a higher standard, because what happens is, like, your own side will hold you to the same standard they held the other person, but then the other side will pretend that they care about these basic things, too. So you have, like, fucking sociopaths like Ted Cruz being like, oh, I'm disappointed in the NBA. Yet Ted Cruz didn't say fucking shit about, like, all these politicians, which I think it's, like, the NBA could have done better. I'm not saying the NBA, like, is, 1,000 cookie points, God praise the NBA. But, to their credit, I think they in the days that follow, they kind of pleasantly surprised me. Because what happened then is, like, Chinese government basically demanded that, like, you motherfuckers need to fire Daryl Morey. And then Adam Silver is commissioner of the NBA. So basically, what a commissioner of the NBA is kind of the head honcho of the league as a whole. He's not necessarily...
He's Roger Goodell for the NBA.
Yeah, he's Roger Goodell of the NBA. He's basically like what the president is to the exec... Like, the NBA as an organization is basically like the executive branch of the NBA as a league. And then all 32 teams are basically like Congress, if you want to view it as like an almost sort of governmental structure.
Yeah, so
Adam Silver is essentially like the U.S. president, but of sports. And he came out, he's like, we support everyone's rights to, speak their mind on issues. And they didn't fire him. And Chinese government's super pissed. And now it's like, they're kind of in a match, they're kind of in a game of chicken with each other, because... China doesn't want to lose the NBA, all right? Like, they still need these things. Like, they still want these products for their people because it's profitable for them.
And it's an opiate for the masses.
And, as much as, like, sort of the, gladiators, breads and circuits, yada, 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 it's kind of a trite point. There is some truth to it. If you can get entertainment products in your country, that makes people happier and much more willing to put up with the other shit, like having a censorship network on your internet.
Yeah. So, like, the thing is with the NBA, I think the organization at large handled it okay for a capitalist organization that's interested in making money. However, I think that the Rockets...
Yeah, it definitely seems like the Rockets
seem to
personally
handle it poorly.
Although, to their credit, and who knows, maybe this will get posted Wednesday, and then Morey will get fired. I wouldn't be shocked if Daryl Morey got fired, kind of like, as soon as they have the thinnest excuse, they fire him, but he was a little bit, so it's for some, like, background for, like, people who don't follow it like I do, because this is not necessarily, like, I don't feel like this podcast is necessarily going to reach a lot of, like, super deep sports fans like me, but, for some background about it, like, Daryl Morey is, like, kind of universally considered, one of the best GMs in the league, but he's had a lot of conflict because the ownership, Tillman Fertitta, recently bought the team, like, less than 2 years ago, and he's been one of those guys, and this happens all the time in sports. New owner comes in, and he's like, I'm going to show everyone, I'm going to make my waves, and I'm the best, whatever, and that's caused a lot of conflict. So it's like, they haven't exactly been getting along great to begin with, so it wouldn't have been, like, shocking if he got fired pre-Hong Kong thing, but, like, definitely, he's probably going to get fired by the end of this year. It'll be interesting to see whether they wait until they have, like, a legit semi-excuse basketball-wise to fire him, or whether they'll try to do the Boston Red Sox famously just fire all their managers on, like, Christmas Day, so, like, no one's paying attention. Whether they try to sneak that under the goalie other than fact.
I mean, okay. I was reading the article on I was reading the article on Reddit, and then I came to the comment section, and somebody had collated a list of like corporations actively kowtowing to Chinese rule, as it were.
Yeah, and it's sort of it becomes complicated, right? Because like, so Google, for example, like people have used Google. Google has been one of like the original like Chinese kowtowers.
Yeah, like it's they. I mean,
they famously took "Do not be evil" out of their company tagline.
Yeah, and I mean, like
which is just kind of hilarious.
It's also a little weird, but like them and Apple, you know, like they're doing these little things, and I mean, you know, they're little, I guess, but like, well, actually, Google's thing isn't little. Actively creating a censorship network is dangerous.
But here's the thing about Google, though,
enabling a totalitarian government on an international scale to continue to oppress their people. That's on them.
I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it, because like, okay, like it's fun to dunk on corporations and all that, but like if you're Google, like if I'm the guy in charge of Google, right? Like, and the Chinese government's like, hey, we'll let you have, you know, Chinese Google, but it can't be like American Google. You've got to give us the power to let them own, okay? Like, it almost is an irresponsible, like, you can, if you decide you're going to make a moral argument in favor of Google, you say like, well, I'm going to create 10,000 American jobs creating this Chinese infrastructure. It'll help these 10,000 people better their lives in America. People's lives in China will be better because then they can use Google instead of the actual, like, literally, like, Chinese government developed inferior, even more censored version of it. Like, you can easily, if you're in charge of Google and you have a soul, like, you can come up with a moral argument to do it. Now, the problem with that is that, you know, you can come up with a moral argument to do just about anything short of murder.
Hell, you could come up with a moral argument to do murder. Well, I guess it wouldn't be murder in most cases. It'd be self-defense. But, like, the core issue is there's this, and I mean this coming from even like your Trumpers, you know, there's a massive disdain for the concept, let alone the actual consequence, of a foreign government that is perceived to be unjust, dictating terms on how an American company runs its business.
In China, for the most part.
Yeah, and I mean, like, and also impacting the lives of people who work for the company, expressing and exercising their free speech. And I mean, okay, so caveat here, free speech does not mean freedom from consequences. It just means that the government can't arrest you for your dumb shit. However, if you say dumb shit, that doesn't stop you from calling you a moron. Right?
Yeah.
So, like, I guess the main thing is like, there are a lot of people out there who believe that criticizing the government is like a national American pastime. You good? Okay, so like, there's a lot of people who believe that criticizing the government is a national American pastime. So when they do it to other countries, which is also a national American pastime, see Angela Merkel and Donald Trump, and then they get punished for it in an unjust fashion, people get really fucking angry, and I get it.
Yeah, and so it ties back. If there's one theme to it, it's that there are a lot of assholes, and while it's easy for Joe Pa Twitter handle 123 to be like, well, yeah, just fuck them, fight them every step of the way. The reality is, conflict is hard. Most people don't want to deal with it. It's unprofitable.
Which is why capitalism is an ineffective system, because nothing gets done if it's not profitable.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, like, not only, but let's just pretend we get rid of capitalism, right? Like, conflict is hard. It's a lot easier because ultimately, if all these American companies announce tomorrow that they will no longer do any business in China whatsoever, which is ultimately what it would take to please these people. And even then, they'll be like, well, no, it's just because we bullied you into it. But
well, I mean, like, okay,
let's even give them some credit and say like it would make these people happy.
Let's say that let's say that. Let's say that the NBA and Activision Blizzard didn't happen yet, and they all just decided collectively when they saw Hong Kong, it's like, yeah, no, you're not getting any more of our products. Well, then what?
I mean, it's not going to change anything. That's the thing. So, like,
I mean, most of the manufacturing that they have is in China anyway, so the manufacturing is just going to continue, but they're just going to keep it in China. And so, like, I mean, will it make a difference? Effectively, no. What would make a difference is if the United States federal government did something with regards to backing China or Hong Kong in a meaningful way. However, I'm not a geopolitical expert, and I don't know how that would happen because, contrary to what a famous businessman once said, trade wars are not good and easy to win. So, I don't know what we could do.
Yeah, it's difficult because, like,
because China has 1 billion fucking people. There are, in China, at least 30 different dialects of Chinese that are not mutually intelligible.
Well, yeah, and, you know, as much as, like, people... I think people a lot of times make things more complicated than they are, right? Like, they'll say, like, oh, it's a real complicated, deep issue a lot of times. Where, like, this is one of those situations where, like, it is actually, like, there's a lot of things you have to consider. And with all these different... All right, so, like, let's just say America makes it illegal. Okay, they put China on the naughty list. The sanctions, like, no business, whatever, they have an official title for it. Like,
we're sanctioning,
for example,
1/6 of the people on the planet. A. B. If we were to sanction we're going to sanction 1 billion people. We're going to sanction one of the largest military powers in the world. We're going to sanction a geopolitical neighbor to Russia, where even if we could get China on our side, Russia's not going to be comfortable with that. So who do you think Russia's going to back? We're sanctioning a totalitarian state that has managed to maintain its grip on power for 70 years, despite explicitly anti-communist world leaders in that time.
Well, yeah, and China at this point it's not communist. I'm not even sure what you call it.
I'm just saying that
China's government system basically it's
an oligarchical capitalism. It's just that most of the companies that make profit in China are owned by the Fed. So because it's oligarchical capitalism, but I mean, I'm not going to nitpick whether or not China's communist. It's what they call themselves, and so naturally, if they call themselves that, then there should be a negative reaction from the conservative end of the Red Scare, i.e. Ronald Reagan. However, with all of Ronald Reagan's big dick energy, there has been no fundamental change in Mao's regime that is now Xi Jinping's regime, and it's going to be incredibly hard to make change because of the geography. We have all of our geopolitical opponents coalesced into one area of the world.
So, how do you fix it? So, one option is to basically give them the Iran treatment and sanction them until they agree to, concessions X, Y, and Z. And then that's before we even run into, the issue that we ran into Iran, which is, the next 5 presidents have to agree to the same terms. Because the issue is,
or at least enforce the terms. I mean, we've been sanctioning the fuck out of Russia for Crimea since 2014 when they did the dumb shit. And now we're just not enforcing it. I mean, the sanctions are there, but we're not doing it. Russians are still in Crimea.
Yeah, and guess what? If Hillary Clinton was president, they'd still be in Crimea.
Yeah.
So, what do sanctions do? So, let's just say blanket trade ban on China. What happens? Well, so all the American companies, it's a significant economic hit to America. All right, and, Twitter handle JoePa123 is like, well, yeah, that's great. Now we can just get rid of capitalism. But, okay, do you want to catch these hands? Are you ready to have 30 years of civil war and hope that the next system is better than the current one? Because guess what? There's no guarantees. Guess what? The Nazis might win World War III in America. The Nazis might win. Okay, the Nazis lost the last civil war. They might win this one.
Yeah, I mean...
Because guess who has all the guns?
Well, I don't know.
Are you ready
Join
to catch these
liberal
hands?
gun clubs.
Everyone assumes that oh yeah, that's easy. All the normies. Well, no, most of the normies should just sit at home and be really sad that they can't get coffee anymore because all the coffee has been raided by militia gangs along the southern border.
Yeah, so there's this really important thing that any group in power keeps in mind, and I guarantee that they keep it in mind when they do something, is that their people, are 9 meals away from revolution. But as long as they have those 9 meals and they're in comfort, they're docile. Do you think it's a coincidence that people live paycheck to paycheck in America? People can't afford to protest effectively because then they starve. But the thing is if somehow the United States government, now I'm getting into conspiracy theory territory, or at least I sound like it, but there is a fine line that the lower and middle class are being balanced on, where it's making it damn near impossible for them to protest while also making them comfortable enough to not care.
Well, yeah. So I mean, the reality is and it's not even a conspiracy, right? It's just there certain people are going to say okay, we should give them this
it's morphine drip feeding.
Kind of.
Ish.
I mean
that's a little drastic, but and I mean it would take something. I don't even know if we could have a revolution or a riot, a rebellion like Hong Kong has, effectively, because Hong Kong is reacting to the fact that their way of life is being threatened on a massive, massive scale.
Right, and it's being threatened in a way that it's just fundamentally that's never happened to anyone who's living in the United States today. It just hasn't. You can say all these different things about Donald Trump, but the reality is, unless you are an undocumented immigrant or a dreamer here in America, you are not being threatened the same way that people in Hong Kong are.
Yeah, and I mean it's going, even for your hardest core liberals, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to do anything other than go picket your local politician or the big ones in Washington, D.C. to demand that they treat dreamers and illegal immigrants fairly and not keep them in fucking cages, because it's not affecting their lifestyle.
In a meaningful way.
They can still go out arbitrarily in the middle of the night on a Wednesday and get a fucking cheeseburger from McDonald's and go home and watch Judge Judy and their CSI stand-in, whatever it is now.
NCIS is still on TV.
NCIS is still on TV. But there's... They've not given the middle class, the I vote for the dude I have a beer with population has not been given an adequate reason for them to instigate any sort of meaningful rebellious action, and I don't think it ever could.
And by the way, when we're talking meaningful, we're talking taking some guns and taking over the
talking
courthouse.
Storming DC type meaningful action.
We're talking Area 51, but not
Area 51, but unironically. I mean, I guess Area 51 was semi-unironic, but it was more hey, I went to the thing. It was like Burning Man, but for
Area 51 was 100% ironic. Let's be clear here.
Actually,
I don't want to recap the Area 51 rant from episode 2, but okay.
It was meme. It was meme. It was like Burning Man, but for morons or for meme gods.
Yeah, I mean, it was just again, no one was serious about that. Everyone, then all of a sudden, all these
it's like Wyatt Earp with 1,000 people on his doorstep ready to storm his house, and he pulls his gun out and he's like, okay, who wants to get shot first? Nobody wants to get shot first, man. They're not being given a compelling reason to get gunned down by the fastest gun in the West. The Area 51. I'm not even sure you could get people to storm Area 51 if they found out that they were hiding Native American kids in there or something. Like,
well, I can guarantee
experimenting Native American on the Navajo in the area.
I guarantee you they don't, because guess what? That's what's happening right now.
I mean, with illegal immigrants, which some people believe deserve whatever the fuck they deserve. Like, I'm talking about, like,
How about all the people online that are getting mad about Ellen? How about you go protest an ICE camp? There's one in your area, mathematically, almost with near certainty. Like, and guess what? I know you have the free time to do it because you spent so much time online being mad about Ellen. Like, it's not that... And it don't give me the, oh, well, I work 80 hours a week because of capitalism, so I can't do it.
And I mean, like, if we want to really, really, really bring this back to the whole Ellen thing, the bottom line is we have bigger fish to fry than it has been in a day. We have bigger fish to fry than it has been in a daytime shock talk show host hanging out together at a football game. We have an idiot in charge of the White House who is actively burning the Constitution to the ground, and a literal Voldemort running the Senate.
Yeah. So maybe, like, I mean, you know, get mad at, like, the really bad people, I guess. Like, just don't worry about
I think that when liberals get mad at the small shit, it minimizes when we get mad at the big shit. Like people who get upset because some athlete quoted rap lyrics 10 years ago on his Twitter.
Yeah.
Like, people getting
my favorite example.
People getting mad about that. It's my favorite example too. People getting mad about that. I mean, I understand to an extent, but at the same time, like, you know, we're getting mad at past actions instead of worrying about present and future actions. Like, if you like, you tell you what, if you want to get mad about racist shit, get mad about somebody who's still dropping the hard R on Twitter today or something, which I guess is a bannable offense, so that probably doesn't happen. But like,
oh no, it's not.
It's not a bannable offense.
I don't think. I mean,
holy shit, what is wrong with
Richard Spencer's loud on Twitter.
Richard Spencer's like, Jesus fucking Christ, Richard Spencer.
I mean, the whole, this is probably, because we need to wrap up here, but
like, you know,
the fact that our social media platforms are slowly turning into outright conservative propaganda, probably a good topic for next episode. But
and I mean, like, so I guess if I had a closing thought, hey, there's a segue. It's pick your battles, you know. Like,
you know what? It's okay. You know, most people, like, if you want to sit down, like, you know, and that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, you can only... a lot of this has been like, hey, who fucking cares if Ellen's talking to George W. Bush, all right? Like, the flip side of this is, like, you know, not every single thing that... It's okay to, like, rag on people who do, like...
dumb shit, or hypocritical shit. But it's one thing to... you know, maybe give side-eye to Ellen and be like, what are you doing with this guy? And it's an entirely different thing to argue about it and blow it up into an well, not literally an international incident, but an international incident, because if everything's an international incident, then nothing is. Yes, I'm quoting Incredibles.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, like, the Blizzard one, like, the reason I brought that up and compared to Ellis thing, like, that... I'm actually a little bit proud of how people have been mad about this. Like, that's...
People have, like...
I get it. Like, to bring this back to, like, the whole China thing, like, I get it. Okay, these businesses are going to do business with China because that's just the reality. You can make a moral argument that they should do business with China because that creates American jobs and doesn't... and, if anything, improves the life of Chinese citizens, given the fact that just China's government is going to stay in power whether American governments...
let the NBA be in the country or not.
American corporations cooperate with them or not. There's a whole other thing about, like, well, maybe the American government should stop cooperating with them, but then you get in a whole can of worms or, like, do you really want all these people in America to lose their jobs? Do you really want to potentially start World War III?
Do you really want to
trigger an entire
1,000 times more expensive?
Yeah, do you really want to trigger a global recession just to prove a point? You know,
like,
some people might because they're ready for World War III, but, you know, most people don't. And even me, Mr. Big Talk, Mr.
It's not a controversial, like, it's not exactly a controversial opinion that war is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, you mentioned you were proud of them. I mean, I think that there's some credibility now to the concept of a keyboard warrior because, people have been preaching vote with your wallets forever, but now that there's actually been backlash, so much so to the point that now Blizzard is requiring photo identification before you cancel your accounts, that means something. And I think that, people on the internet can't do much, I can't afford to travel to fucking wherever the hell a Blizzard HQ is, or Hong Kong, and smuggle in some firearms and go dance on the graves of cops who are shooting civilians because they're protesting. Like, I can't do that. I can't afford it. It's not practical or pragmatic. But what I can do what some people can do is try to instigate change in how things that they pay money to interact with things that they care about.
Right, and to bring it up, I think a lot of times the standard that people set, so this will be the last thought for this, will be the real for realsies closing thought. The thing is, a lot of people are like, well, this doesn't fix every single problem, therefore you should do the most extreme, most difficult version for this, and if you're not on board with the most extreme, most difficult version of this, then you're just as bad as the Nazis. And the problem is when you hold people to this standard, then everyone just turns on each other.
Nobody makes it to that. And not everybody makes it to that standard. Like, even if they're trying to make it there, they're not going to.
To some degree, that's kind of what's happened to the Obama legacy, which a whole can of worms that I don't want to get into because we really need to wrap this up.
Yes,
but this is kind of what's happened to the Obama legacy, where
he wasn't left enough.
Well, not even just that literal thing, but it's just like, well, Obama didn't pursue the basically getting rid of private health insurance. Well, his version of the bill did have the public option, which I get it. It's not the Sanders bill that would get rid of the private health industry altogether, but the public option was out there. That would essentially be a pretty much like the public option that was originally the core of Obamacare is essentially the system that a lot of these other countries are cited. That's essentially the system that like Great Britain has. It's a slightly worse system than like what can't. Basically anything outside of it, it's basically other than like some Nordic countries where like most of the hospitals are actually state run and everything. Like it's the most common model that's out there. And you say, well, all these other countries suck too, but again, like it's okay to not, fix everything in one go. But
we need to step in the right direction. Not everything can be illegal.
Yeah.
Hey, Future Mason here, and I just wanted to go ahead and now's a good time to go ahead and add a coda to the comments that LeBron James made Tuesday. I am recording this at about 2:04 p.m. Wednesday, and first, let's just go ahead and dive into the actual quotes that were spoken by LeBron James. So this is what he had to say about 10 days after the Daryl Morey tweet, and, he had the time to sit down and really think about what he was going to say ahead of time. And LeBron has been, one of the most really thoughtful and really media-savvy athletes that we've ever had. So keep it in mind when you hear the quotes LeBron James said after several days of him and his PR team, had to sort of prepare and get a general idea of what he was going to say when he eventually felt like he had to speak out, which he did not have to speak out, by the way, but that's a whole separate issue. We'll get to that later. So these are LeBron's quotes, and he said, I think when we all sit back and learn from the situation that happened, understand that what you could tweet or say could affect people, we all talk about this freedom of speech. Yes, we do have freedom of speech, but at the same time, there are ramifications for the negative that can happen when you're not thinking about others and you're only thinking about yourself. I don't want to get into a word with Daryl Morey, but I believe he wasn't educated on the situation at hand, and he spoke, and as so many people could have been harmed, not only financially, but physically, emotionally, spiritually. So be careful what we tweet, yada, yada, yada. A lot of negative things can come from that, too. So basically, if you hear those words, and that is the complete unedited quote, and that's about all he had to say on the matter. He did amend his statement later via Twitter. We'll get to that in a moment. But really, if you hear those words coming out of LeBron James, it is very similar to like what we say when like Nazis get banned from Twitter, and Nazis will say like, oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. We'll be like, well, private entity does not have a responsibility to let you tweet racist things, right? That is the same language that we use when we're saying that like Nazis' free speech shouldn't be defended by private organizations. But he's saying it about someone who tweeted freedom for Hong Kong, right? So that is really, really fucking awful. And there's really no way to defend that. Now, later, LeBron sort of amended his statement. He's like, let me clear up a confusion, which, let's be clear, LeBron, there were no confusion, but let's move on. He says, I do not believe there is any consideration for the consequences and ramifications of the tweet. I'm not discussing the substance. Others can talk about it. My team and this league went through a difficult week. I think people need to understand what a tweet and statement can do to others, and yada yada, right? So that sounds really, really... Basically what he's saying is not his argument for why that statement wasn't that bad was because he's trying to say that, like, Daryl Morey didn't know what the consequences of saying freedom for Hong Kong via Twitter would be. Now, I do think that is true. I don't think Daryl Morey thought this was going to trigger an international incident, right? If the GM of the Grizzlies or the GM of the Hawks rather than the GM of the Rockets, the most popular team in China because the Rockets had Yao Ming there for about a decade. You know, if some other GM, you know, China wouldn't have noticed, they wouldn't have cared. And also, Daryl Morey has been really active and really vocal in the media sphere in general, right? Like, Daryl Morey is probably the most famous NBA GM outside of, I'm sure there's probably a former player GM that I'm not thinking of, but outside of, you know, maybe like Danny Ainge, who used to be an NBA player prior to becoming a GM, like Daryl Morey is the most famous GM who is not an NBA player prior, right? Like, people know who Daryl Morey is, and so he has a lot more of a platform than what a typical GM is, right? If the Grizzlies GM tweets freedom for Hong Kong, no one notices. So I do think it's fair to say, like, Daryl Morey wasn't necessarily trying to make this really public declarative statement in the same way that, like, people are comparing this to the Colin Kaepernick situation, all right? Morey is not Kaepernick. He is not falling on the sword and taking one for the team to make a social stance. All right. Daryl Morey has not said a word since this whole thing blew up. He's kind of just hunkered down, metaphorically hunkered down in the bunker and not said a word. No one's really calling him out on that, which is kind of interesting. But you're right. Like, he wasn't trying to stir this shit up in the way, like, when Kaepernick kneeled, Kaepernick was intentionally trying to make a point and stir shit up, which is fine. I'm not saying Daryl Morey has a social responsibility to blow up in $1 billion deal with China because he doesn't approve of some of their human rights violations, all right? I feel like the whole conversation that we've had over the full 2 hours with me and Joel kind of, proves my point. Like, I was talking about, like, Google does business in China. Are we going to Twitter cancel or just stop using Google products? Well, you can make a moral argument that, like, if Google doesn't offer China a basically censorship version of their service, China will either their government will develop their own censorship search engine for their people to use, or they will find another company to do it for them. One of those two things will happen. So if you're doing it from the perspective of Google, they're like, well, someone's going to do it anyway. Even if all the American companies don't do it, China is a large enough government they can do it themselves, so why don't we create American jobs? Now you can say, well, that's a bullshit argument, and maybe it is, but, if there's a moral argument, if you can make a moral argument in favor of doing the financially more lucrative and socially easier frictionless thing to do, people are going to do it. That's just reality. We live in a world, we all have a little bit of selfishness in them, and I don't want to recap the whole thing where I'm just talking about, the inherent selfishness of man, whatever, again. So LeBron says this, and unfortunately I think it is really bad because, like, he did not have to say anything, okay? This was actually dying down before he came out and said something. And unfortunately, I think, like, LeBron has a movie coming out, Space Jam 2. It's coming out in 2021. All right, the second biggest market in the world for Hollywood movies is China. All right, LeBron has a $1 billion contract with Nike, and some of that contract includes him getting Nike stock. So he is financially incentivized to, curtail to China to some point. That said, going out of your way, and I don't think it's fair to say, like, LeBron's follow-up saying, like, Morey didn't understand the consequences. Yeah, that's true. I don't think he understand the consequences. But at the same time, I don't think that was, at least on its own, the point you were making. Like, it was frankly a despicable point you were making about, like, oh, Morey shouldn't have said that because it affects my bottom line. And I understand it affects more bottom line, right? Like, NBA players had a preseason game in China, and there were a lot of protests going on by the Chinese citizens, not the government, the citizens going out and protesting against the NBA because Morey said this thing against their government. That's sort of the thing that people are not talking about right now, is that the everyday people, just like you and me, that, go through life, go to their work, consume entertainment products, the everyday common people of China were pissed about this, all right? That is a thing that happened. This isn't some Chinese conspiracy. Now, on the flip side, a lot of the reason that so many people in China have been, so supportive of their government is because of the fact that they don't have access to whatever media they want to access in the same way that we do, right? Like, I don't want to use the word brainwashed because brainwash kind of takes away the agency of, individuals that live in the Chinese government. But at the same time, like, it's not fair to say that, like, they are entirely responsible for their own viewpoints because they have not had access to the same. Like, a lot of them don't know about the human rights abuses that their governments are committing. They don't really even know what Twitter is, or they probably have some concept of what Twitter is, right? But they don't understand freedom of speech as a lived experience in the same way that we do because they have lived their entire lives in China. And so LeBron, was playing a preseason game in China. He sees this as, to some degree, probably feels a little unsafe and uncomfortable. And he's like, yes, this was also bad because it created a situation where we were playing in China during the period of time that, these Chinese people were pissed at us, and it made me feel unsafe to some degree. Like, that is also true. But at the same time, like, you've just got to be smarter. Like, all right, if you're someone who you're not happy that Morey tweeted this, okay, and you can be unhappy that Morey tweeted this as an NBA player. I totally get that you may be unhappy because of that. Not just because, like, you're unsafe, but, like, I get it. You yourself did not make the decision to take a stance that will hurt your bottom line. All right? And someone else, to some degree, made that issue for you, and that's kind of unfair. That said, all you had to do was shut up and go about your business. I don't want to use the phrase "shut up and dribble" that alt-right asshole Laura Ingraham said, but like you do not have to speak on every social issue, and I think that has been something that like other NBA fans online, on Reddit, on Twitter, etc., have been incredibly unfair about with some of the other people like Steve Kerr, who has been very vocal about domestic issues when it comes to gun violence in America, when it comes to Donald Trump just as a president, as an entity, as a sort of just a figure of idiocy and evil, has been very outspoken about this. And people, first thing, and unfortunately, this is kind of unfair, but this is just the reality. If you are a public figure and you go out of your way to speak out on certain issues, people are going to start going out and wanting to get your take on every issue. That's just the reality. And, Steve Kerr is a very smart, savvy guy. He understood this when he made those comments about Trump, when he made those comments about assault weapons in America, which is part of why it was such a great thing for him to do. All right. The sacrifice you make as a public figure who comments on these things is that you are just treated to a higher standard. That's one of the reasons why, like, James Harden, for example, he has not really been outspoken on this stuff. And, he just wants to play basketball, and that's totally okay. Not every single person has to be, engaged about every single issue. But part of the problem is, like, if we start attacking, like, Steve Kerr, for example, to I'd probably need to rewind here for a little bit. Steve Kerr was asked about the Hong Kong issue, and his comments essentially came out to no comment. It's not my lane. I do not live in China. And then later he's like, we as Americans shouldn't be as critical of what's happening in China when we have all these issues, mass shootings, Trump, etc. And that last bit, I get why people are a little upset about that last bit, because it's a little bit of whataboutism, where it's like comparing the issues in China, the issues in America is a little unfair, because the issues in China kind of go against what we as Americans see as core, freedom of speech. It's very complicated. I get why people are upset about that last bit, but at the same time, so Steve Kerr is doing these good things, and therefore he gets way more flack for not standing up on a podium and screaming "fuck China" at the cost of millions of dollars. And by the way, these are not millions of Steve Kerr's dollars. All right, Steve Kerr is a coach. He does not count his money. Steve Kerr's personal money is unaffected by how much money the NBA is making. And let me explain why. All right. So players in the NBA, they have a salary cap. Basically, the players get 51% of the money that the NBA generates. The organizations, the teams get 49% of that money. But that 49% also goes to paying for stuff like, improvements to the stadium, staff at the stadium, coaches, etc. So really, these NBA teams get 20 to 25% of the money, and then the 51% of the money that the players get split proportionately between all the different players. There's also a salary cap. You can go above that salary cap in certain situations. So it gets a little bit more complex, but essentially, teams have their pot, players have their pot. Now, there is a limit to how much NBA teams are allowed to spend on the players, all right? If you're someone who follows sports and listens to podcasts, you're yeah, I know how the salary cap works. But essentially, Steve Kerr does not count against a salary cap. So if the NBA's revenue goes down, Steve Kerr's still making the same money because he doesn't count against that salary cap. And there's really no reason for the team to cut down his salary, because then he'll go coach somewhere else, and they just lost a valuable asset for no reason. So if he were to speak out against the NBA, it's not his money that's getting affected. It's his players' money. And guess what? When you're a coach, you talk to the players every day, you have, I don't want to say a responsibility, but you definitely have a stake in their life. And I think this kind of ties into even what LeBron says, and where I will stand up for him a little bit, right? Daryl Morey's bottom line is not affected by criticizing Hong Kong, because he does not count against the salary cap. He's going to be making the same amount of money whether he speaks out against Hong Kong or not. Regardless of how much revenue the NBA generates, both Daryl Morey and Steve Kerr will make the same amount of money. And I believe this is why Steve Kerr doesn't necessarily want to comment on Hong Kong, when they might get pissed and tomorrow decide they're just going to pull the plug and say fuck it, the NBA is banned from China. And Steve Kerr, whose money is not affected on it, may not feel like it's necessarily fair for him to say something that would affect the bottom line of people other than him. Because if Steve Kerr takes a stance, it doesn't hurt him, it hurts his players. And I do think that's part of it, is that LeBron's mad at Daryl Morey because what the fuck are you doing? You're not hurting your bottom line, you're hurting my bottom line. And at the same time, what really bothers me about the LeBron thing is that he used the phrase uneducated about the situation, while he himself is clearly not super educated about the situation in China or the situation in Hong Kong, which again, you're a professional athlete, you're not a politician. I'm not saying you have to be super educated about every issue, but if you don't accuse someone of being uneducated about the situation when you are uneducated about the situation, all right? Daryl Morey is an MIT graduate, all right? LeBron, you've only got a high school diploma, which, not that the level of, school education is the level of intelligence you have, but that is literally the phrase you use the word. You didn't say stupid, you said uneducated, when this person has a college degree and you do not. And so really just kind of, if you're going to keep your head down about it, that's one thing. To kind of summarize this, because I've got on to the point where I'm rambling, I get keeping your head down. To go back to the Google example, right? refusing to play or make money in China and curtail them to some degree, I get, because if China cuts out the NBA tomorrow, because like all the figures of the NBA stand up with fist raised and say like fuck China, right? It's not going to improve citizen situation in China. It's just going to make the citizens of China's lives worse for the purpose of making it's self-flagellation. It's just doing this. This is not the same situation as like Muhammad Ali is kind of the example people use. Like, well, Muhammad Ali lost 3 years of his prime to stand up for what he believes in. Why can't these other players do it? Well, this is different because the United States government drafted Muhammad Ali into the military. Now, Muhammad Ali was not going to be fighting Viet Cong, all right? Because it's kind of always been understood that if you're a celebrity and you get drafted in the military, and I shouldn't say always understood, Vietnam is basically the only time that this ever really became a thing, but basically it was understood by the U.S. government that like technically you had to be part of a military if you were drafted, but they would just have Muhammad Ali like tour these foreign military bases and basically do propaganda for them. And Muhammad Ali was basically like, fuck this. I'm not going to let the United States government force me to do their propaganda. That is not what is going on with China. All right. The NBA, to their credit, has said like, hey, people are allowed to say what they want in this league. And the thing with Mori is that he is not being forced to say I'm pro-China. He's just sort of encouraged to not necessarily speak out against China because it kind of goes against the bottom line of the NBA as an entity and the players, but not Maury himself, which I think is kind of what LeBron was so mad about, because it doesn't affect Maury's bottom line. He's going to get paid the same amount of money whether the salary cap of the NBA goes up or not, because NBA players' salaries are tied to a percentage of the salary cap. So if the NBA makes less money, the players get paid less. And that's before we even get into the whole, his endorsement with Nike, Space Jam 2 coming out in 2021, all that other stuff. I'm not even getting into that. I'm just saying like the actual money that players are getting paid by the league is less if China decides to ban the NBA from there. So while I do understand people not necessarily wanting to mess with that because it's not necessarily, like in Steve Kerr's case and Maury's case, it's not really necessarily their bottom line. And the players' case, most of them don't have a college degree, which, because you're not going to spend 4 years in college if you're a great NBA player. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But, if you're not a college-educated person, when it comes to, like, you may have a lot more to say about stuff that happens in America that to some degree affects you directly versus, let's be frank, the stuff in Hong Kong and the stuff in China, that does not affect, me daily or really in any way. And it doesn't affect, the NBA players directly in any way. Whereas like these issues about, social justice, they do have an impact, if not necessarily directly to the NBA player, especially if you're like a white NBA player. It affects people that they know closely. Most of them probably don't really know anyone who lives in either China or Hong Kong. I know I don't, and, I spent several years playing online games and met people from many other countries that I still talk to this day, and I don't know anyone who lives in Hong Kong or China. So, like, if you're someone who doesn't live there, it also may not necessarily be fair for someone who doesn't live in China to comment on the quality of life in China. Like I said, Chinese citizens are pissed about that. Like people, just everyday people who live in China are not happy about what Daryl Morey tweeted. And I already went over the whole thing about how their opinion is not necessarily fair to use a barometer either because it's been heavily influenced by the government, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, it's not fair for us, people who do not live in China, to say like, oh, we're speaking on their behalf. It's no different than like, when issues of like in the LGBTQ community and all the straight white people want to come out and have their take on it and say like they want to get offended on behalf of LGBTQ people, when the actual LGBTQ people who should be the ones that are offended, a lot of them are like, hey, don't speak on behalf of me. I didn't care about X comment. I get it, like it's not politically correct or whatever, but I've got bigger issues to worry about, and that's totally fine. Like, you know, it's speaking on behalf of marginalized people is just, it's such a complicated issue because, like, if you're a marginalized person, you should be able to speak on behalf of yourself. At the same time, I'm a straight white guy. I have more of a voice in America just because I'm a straight white guy. That's not fair, but that's the way the world is. But so, like, LGBTQ people, they're kind of in a very unfair situation where they'd prefer to just be able to speak on their own behalf, but they almost sort of need advocates of people who are not socially marginalized in order for their voices to be heard. It's this very complicated thing. And with people in China, it's more like most people who live in America, don't even have a concept of living under an oppressive Chinese government. Some of them are perfectly happy with their lives. Yes, they don't be able to criticize the government or whatever, but, most people live in China have a comfortable middle class living similar to how we do, right? It's kind of the same thing where, like, people in America, we can say, like, oh, everything about America sucks, but ultimately I'm sitting in an air-conditioned room. I'm recording a podcast on a fancy, like, semi-professional mic. People in China can do all this stuff too. They just can't criticize the government, which they should be able to criticize the government. I'm not saying they shouldn't be able to criticize the government, but from their perspective, there are certain things. At the same time, this is to go back to the Steve Kerr quote. Steve Kerr's like, who are we to criticize their living situation when we have, like, mass shootings here in America? China doesn't have mass shootings. They are a lot. The average middle class citizen in China, as long as they keep their mouth shut about criticizing the government, and we've already covered that's unfair, that they should not have to, they should be able to criticize their government, but as long as they don't criticize the government, they are a lot safer than we are here in America. And because of, crime in urban populations and mass shootings and all this other terrible shit that happens here that doesn't necessarily happen in China. So to summarize here, like, it's one thing to, not want to necessarily comment on that. And I personally am okay with that. But if you're going to get mad at other people for doing the same thing, like, honestly, just fuck off with that. And that'll be our podcast for this week. I am going to, I'm experimenting with me just talking to a mic on my own versus, like in the past where I've always had someone converse with me. So I'm probably going to talk about Joker, the movie, even though, the algorithm says, like, don't talk about Joker. We're done having that conversation. I meant to do it the day after I saw the movie. I didn't because I'm a lazy piece of shit. But we'll probably talk about Joker. I might do some other stuff if, like, there's something, like, so newsworthy that, like, I don't think Joel or some of the other... Eventually, at some point, I'm going to have other guests on the show, right? But, like, for example, probably am not going to know someone personally who's a huge NBA fan like me unless I talk to Dad about it. Now I'm rambling again. But... basically, I'm going to try out some of the solo pod stuff a little bit more. Let me know what you think. If you're listening at this point, it's probably because you know me personally. But if you don't know me personally, comment on the YouTube channel. At some point, this podcast is going to be on iTunes, etc. Rate, review, etc. And let me know, like, what you don't like. I would like to, even though this is, like, mostly a personal thing where, I'm not exactly, like, let's be frank, I don't have an audience, but even though this is, like, a personal thing, I would like to hear about how I can improve my product. So please let me know, either comment on YouTube or, like I said, if you're listening and you're already at the end of the podcast, it's probably because you know me personally. So you can text me, message me. If I see you in person regularly, you can tell me in person, etc. Thanks for listening, everyone.